Jack, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's fantastic to have you here, especially with this moment in time. We're seeing a massive explosion in generative AI. And this is, I think, the perfect time to get a company on the podcast, just like Spoke.ai, and for someone like you to talk about what you're doing in this space. So first of all, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Sure, Nick. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So before we get into Spoke.ai, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about yourself and understand a little bit about your background before you got involved with Spoke.
Sure. So I'm originally from London, actually, but I've been out in Berlin for the last 8 years. So I guess I'd call that home now, probably. Moved out here after university and started out at Rocket Internet, which was quite an interesting time in Berlin back then because everyone was working for a Rocket Internet startup. So you'd go out for drinks on a Friday night and it would be not which company do you work for, but which rocket company do you work for, right? So there was Zalando and HelloFresh were obviously the big success stories along with Delivery Hero. And then most of the companies people were working for aren't necessarily there anymore, but that was quite an interesting time, obviously. And then I joined N26 fairly early on. So I think I was maybe employee number 90 or 100 or so, just as they had got the banking license from Wirecard. So I think obviously there's a story there with Wirecard and what everything followed and what followed on from there. And then I was 3 years at N26 working on the product side. Amazing time, worked with incredible people, built lots of different interesting products, including a lot of stuff in AI for the final year. So worked on the chatbot and scaled that up. So it was, I think, handling around 35% of N26's customer service volume by the end. So many millions of euros, which was quite a cool impact to have with the team. And then worked out in San Francisco for a little bit. And that was obviously very exciting to work with people, in the Bay Area, see how all of the products get built there. Obviously, it's infamous or famous, or depending on which way you think about it. And that was a cool experience to learn from some of those people. Then came back to Berlin, built and bootstrapped our first company, Plant Club. And then about a year and a half, 2 years ago, moved on to Spoke and have been working on that ever since.
Amazing. I'm very interested then, your first entrepreneurial endeavor with Plant Club. Can you tell us a little bit about how you started that? And did you always have an interest in entrepreneurship, that you always wanted to build your own thing? Or was this something that just ended up kind of naturally occurring?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, it was something that was always there, but there's this classic thing of like, it's never the right time to start something. And I probably would have imagined that I would have done it a little bit later. Certainly still felt very junior and pretty green, I think, when we first founded Plant Club. Sorry, that wasn't the plant-related pun necessarily intended. But the idea then was, I think, I'd been very much in this kind of venture-backed space, B2C with N26 and with ONE Finance, where I was afterwards, and wanted to step back, also move a little bit out of product for a bit and see whether it was possible to build something B2B and bootstrapped as well. And then was lucky enough to kind of reconnect with Max, who was someone I had worked with quite closely actually at N26 and was a friend, but had been working in the mobility space then. And we were talking about it and just kind of spitballing ideas. And it was one of those things, people ask me, how did you end up with plants? And honestly, it was quite random. It was like, hey, I feel like that's kind of a broken thing. And at N26, we had, they wanted to obviously green up the office and make it look a little bit less like a bank and more like a young startup. But obviously the plants that you could get were quite Deutsche Bank, right? They were quite old school. And so they didn't really bring that vibe. So there was always this kind of disconnect and this dissonance. And we wondered, okay, maybe we could do something that was like a kind of SaaS model applied to a real world thing. And then, Plant Club basically went from there.
Amazing. So how did you then go from plants into generative AI?
Yeah, that's a bit of a jump. I mean, luckily enough, for the first year, so with Plant Club, obviously we really had some dirt under our fingernails. Max and I did a lot of potting and lifting and driving and stuff, but over time managed to find people who actually knew what they were doing with plants and operations there. Oh, sorry, the light above me turns off if I don't move around.
It's all good.
And so we found people who could professionalize it a little bit, and we basically handed over to them. And we knew always that we kind of wanted to get back into the more of the tech space. And honestly, the idea for Spoke, I think, had been bubbling away for a little while. Like at N26, as the company scaled. So I mentioned, Max and I joined around kind of 80, 90 people, and both left when we had got to about 1,500. And we just saw through that time, through this hyper growth, the challenges that the company faced around information sharing. So it was, huge amounts of information being exchanged on Slack, many different Slack channels. You're getting tagged in many places. You can't possibly keep up. You get tagged somewhere and you have to read up on everything, or then, you've got stuff coming in via email from, the C-level typically, or external partners or whatever. So it was just, in general, this topic of like information overload. And we knew we wanted to tackle something within that, and started out with a direction, and that kind of eventually morphed into more the generative space over the last kind of year of iteration, let's say.
Very interesting. Yeah, and I can fully attest to that feeling of information overload. I also share a product background like you. And I know jumping between all these different systems and notifications, it's very hard to manage. So when it comes then to Spoke and your first, let's say the first version of what you created, what did that look like?
Yeah, that was actually a very basic Slack app. And what we wanted to do, so the idea was, everyone has stand-ups every day. People are constantly sharing information, either, synchronously in a video call, or pre kind of COVID, pre hybrid work, it would have been standing around literally around a whiteboard. And we knew that there was that kind of information sharing. And the idea was, what if we could capture that and summarize it? And then, you've got all the stand-ups going on across the company. That's not only something that happens in product engineering teams now, but also HR and marketing and biz dev or whatever. And the idea was like, let's capture all of that information, summarize it, and then you can kind of cascade that information upwards. Didn't quite work that way, but that was at least the vision and the idea.
You were saying that didn't work. So, but then you pivoted, I guess, slightly so that you have a more, well, I won't speak for you. Can you explain what pivot took place and what led you to make that pivot?
Yeah, so we essentially saw that people, whilst they used Spoke for these asynchronous check-ins, for these kind of stand-ups, actually that stand-ups had become something that people wanted to do synchronously more and more because of moving to kind of home office. Then it was often people saying, actually, this check-in is the one time that we all see each other every day. So that became increasingly important, but also crucially, like the quality of the information going in. I think that you'll see, or you see now, with all of the prompt engineering discussion around AI, if you put shit in, you get shit out, basically, excuse my language. But essentially, what we saw is that these updates that go in from people, actually, they can't necessarily be kind of built on top of one another to create a real source of truth, because there's so much distributed in different tools. So we built a product, though, decent usage, like reasonable traction. But actually, and we've just written an article about this that's being posted on our blog today, is we reflected back when it was time to pivot, and what were those kind of signals for pivoting. And they were really, you've got okay traction, but you need to set timelines around that. Like, what does it look like to be successful, and when is the deadline for that kind of success? And recognizing that is something that's, I think, very difficult. So you have to set really clear goals. And on reflection, that we realized we weren't hitting those goals. It didn't look like a viral product. Having some users is actually the most dangerous situation, because people will talk about, you'll have everyone in the team, we're going to let someone down if we don't continue down this path. But that's kind of like a false friend, right? You have to be really convinced about where the real value is. And we then took a look back at the product last fall when we were in San Francisco. Actually, it was funny because we were out there to pitch to TechCrunch, and we all got out there, me and Max and Carl, the other founders, and we had a bit of an identity crisis. Like, what are we what are we doing now? We don't know what we're pitching anymore. The business isn't going in quite the right direction. But it took that, I think, for us to reflect back and then decide that it was time to reevaluate and look at the market again and the product and where we felt that we could really provide value.
I think that's a great point that you make about sort of almost being beholden to your early users. And it really requires bravery then to make that pivot change. What then led you to identify the problem that you're addressing now and go after that?
Yeah, so we knew fundamentally, or we still had the belief that, there's too much information in workplaces, and that actually that was only going to get worse with more tools that people are using. So, now, even in the last few years, there's a SaaS for everything, right? So you've got something for ticketing, you've got your CRM, you've got GitHub, you've got all of these different kind of like fractions of SaaS and tooling that people are using, combined with hybrid work, which has meant more async and more on those tools. And then also with the factor of generative AI, actually. So now what you see is that everyone is going to be generating more content than ever. Notion's got its generative AI, tools like Slight, generating stuff, Gmail, whatever. All of these tools are generating things in there. And we felt that then the only kind of solution, or the way that the market will go, is on distillation, is on summarizing these things back down, making that into a kind of a more coherent, digestible context for people.
So what did your first version of that new product look like? Or is that what we see today with Spoke?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we knew that then we wanted to try to distill all of that information, and there were kind of various pieces that you can look at and things that you can try to distill. What we have today and what we're building out is there are two parts to it. So the first part is a Slack app that we've built, which is live now and people can add and use for free, actually. And this allows you basically to summarize across Slack, which is obviously where people are spending on average 9 hours a day. So it's really often the hub of work and also distraction. And what that allows you to do is go into a thread and summarize that thread. So it happens to people all the time. You get tagged in something 30 messages long, or, you want to stay up to date with what's happening in a particular channel. What you can do with Spoke is go in there, summarize that thread, and within a few seconds, you get like a nice summary with kind of a TLDR, clear outcomes, and you can understand that. And it also allows you to set up channels to receive a digest from. So you can get an overview of what's happening, and those dropped into your inbox every day in Slack. So you can keep up kind of indirectly with what's happening across the organization. And that's the first part of the product, and something that we use also to test out different AI features and understand more around summarization. And the second part, which we're building now and which will go into a closed beta in the next few weeks, is what we call a smart inbox. And that smart inbox basically does three things. So the first thing it does is aggregate your notifications across tools. So you plug it into Slack, Jira, Confluence, Notion is coming. We've got Figma in there, Linear. There'll be tools like Gmail, Miro plugged in there as well. So it aggregates all of those notifications, because we saw from users that that's just a huge issue is, oh my God, I have to look across so many different tools. And people say all the time, I always miss Notion notifications or whatever. And then you get a duplicate notification because someone says, hey, Nick, did you see my message in Notion? And you say no, and they have to drop it over in Slack. So the first thing is really bringing all those together, but you still then have a huge amount of noise, right? That's a lot of notifications, a lot of information flowing into one place. So the real game changers then, the second thing is prioritization. So we're able to understand across all of that information, what is important to you? So, who is it coming from? Are they people that you interact with frequently? Is it in channels that you're very active in? But also, is the content of the message either related to an important project that you're working on, for example, or is the message itself very important? Like, it's different if you ask me, hey, do you want to go for lunch at 12:30, or is the investor deck ready? Those two messages have slightly different weight of importance, even though they may be from the same person. So that's we've got aggregation, we've got prioritization, and the third thing is summarization, right? So we're able to look across your notifications and summarize both within kind of channels and show you, unreads across different kind of areas and summarize there, but also give you summarization of general topics that are going on in your workplace. So you can essentially, with this aggregation, prioritization, and summarization, you can get to inbox zero faster than ever. And this is the focus for the months coming up now.
Wow, that's a very impactful tool, and one which I wish I could get my hands on sooner than its current release date. I'm particularly interested in the prioritization piece of that, the aggregation, the summarization. I got those. The prioritization is a very interesting and kind of tricky problem, because I imagine also you're trying to build Spoke for a number of different role types, not just PMs. And, the content of certain messages has a certain amount of requirement or necessity for a response, depending on your particular type of role. How are you able to kind of untangle that piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is starting with a clear focus, right? So the first versions of Spoke are more for the kind of PM or product vertical and PMs and product leaders there. I think that, the tool set reflects that. So tools like Figma, Jira, Confluence, etc., are more used in that area. But I think as we expand, then it will be taking account of those other tools. But we already, when you plug in Spoke, based on those notifications, we can learn a lot about you and who you respond to and what's important to you directly there. And then I think crucially is training data and retraining the models, right? So, as we're never going to get it perfectly right. It's never going to be, 100% the high priority is correct and the other is correct. It's about implicit and explicit signals there. And what I mean by that is, explicit, you can mark a notification as low priority or high priority, right? So you can explicitly say to the model, move this over. But also implicitly, if you're responding to notifications from me faster than someone else, then we're going to take that as an indicator there. So I think combining those inputs helps us train for you over time. And this is really the future of work, right? Is getting to models and an experience which is personalized to you and works in your way, because there's just no kind of set way, that everyone works, and we have to adapt that. So it has to be inherently flexible within what we build, that it works for you and your use case.
With this solution, at what point did you say to yourselves, we're onto something here? This is the problem space and the solution that we should tackle that problem with. At what point did you say, yes, we're onto something with this now and we're going to go all in?
Yeah, really interesting, I think, process of how you pivot, right? It's like one thing knowing, okay, shit, we need to move away from this. Second is, what do we do and where do we go to? And I think we learned a lot through that process of like how not to do it and how long you can take with deciding something and knowing whether you're on the right track. Fundamentally, the way that we structured it this time was we used a process like this design sprint process, which was popularized by Google Ventures. And it basically allows you to take 4 days to start out with a rough direction. You go through ideation, you prototype something, you show it to people, and you make a decision. And what we did was kind of enhance that process with a few criteria for what we felt would be a success or fail. And what I mean by that, so there's an interesting what's called design partner framework, which is from Unusual VC, which is a venture fund in Silicon Valley. And they talk about design partners as being these organizations that you can basically get on board to build your early product with. And they give a few kind of indications of when someone's a good design partner and when the problem is really tangible. And they talk about things like, people really recognizing and understanding that problem, them having tried to solve it themselves, and them immediately wanting to introduce you to other people in that organization. So we said, if in the interviews that we do, these topics come up, we know that we're kind of onto something. And we combined that with basically a very simple question at the end of the interview, which was, on a scale of 1 to 5, is this something that you would use? Why not? And you get a lot of insight from people there around that. And it sounds obvious, but we showed earlier versions of stuff to people, and they said, yeah, this is a 3, out of 5. And then you ask, what makes it a 4? What makes it a 5? And through that process, you can say, okay, now actually when we're getting 5s consistently and people say, when can I use this? I want to tell my friends about it. Okay, we're onto something. That doesn't mean that you've solved the problem then, but at least I think that means that you're going in the right direction. And that was great because we could get to a conclusion on that new direction within basically 2 weeks of deciding that we wanted to pivot.
How did you, so recently, a couple of months ago, you announced that you had successfully raised quite a bit of money. What evidence, what sort of customer validation or user validation did you go to the market with to say, look, we're onto something. It's not just our opinion. We haven't just made a really cool product here. There's all this kind of groundswell of interest. How did you kind of convince the market that now is the right time to invest in Spoke?
Yes, I mean, we raised the round actually last year and announced it this year. So we raised it,
I see,
before we had pivoted. And I think, it's always interesting when you're raising an early round, right? Because sometimes there is a school of thought that it's easier to raise off a deck alone than even having a product, because when you have only the deck, you have this dream and this great narrative. And sometimes, or often, reality is not quite as shiny and beautiful there. But we were really lucky to speak to a lot of interesting investors. I mean, it was quite funny when we raised last year. Generative AI as a phrase wasn't quite out there, as much as it is now. I think that really started noticing that in September, October, and obviously now I feel like my mom knows what generative AI is even, so it's maybe it's gone too far. But we were lucky to speak to a bunch of really interesting investors who understood the space, I think, really identified with the problem. And then, we were lucky to kind of partner with them on starting to build something out. But of course, there's an expectation also from their side, when you invest early on, that there's going to be pivots around the same problem. I mean, we haven't pivoted as aggressively as Slack did back in the day, right? When they were a gaming company and then they were an IM tool. But I think, we've been really supported by our investors through the process.
Excellent. And it's not just your investors who are supporting you. There's also quite a lot of companies who are interested in the product. The last article I read from TechCrunch was saying that you had a good few hundred interested companies sitting on a waiting list. What does that look like now? Have you grown out that waiting list, or have you now got early stage customers who are paying for the service?
Yeah, so we stay free on the Slack app, which really is for 2 reasons. I think to get a lot of feedback on the summarization and test things out there. And we've had excellent feedback there. So we see over 85% of the summaries we generate being received positively, which is, I think, really, really good. So people can rate a summary with a thumbs up, thumbs down, and we get good feedback there and test out parts of the product. So that part is free. And then we have a few hundred different companies using Spoke, the app for Slack there. Companies as large as 500-600 people. Even actually, I think we onboarded a company which is 1,500 people earlier this week, which is exciting. So obviously a lot of information to summarize there, but also companies even the size of us. So we're 17 people, and we need to summarize information in Slack because there's so much running through there. So that part of the product is completely free, and the smart inbox that we're building, this is free to use in a design partner program. So we're partnered with about 8 companies to build that out over the next couple of months. And the way that setup works is that they get, of course, access to an early product, bugs and all, but give a lot of feedback, and we build it and iterate on it with their vision and needs in mind. And then, of course, monetization comes. We'll introduce that probably Q3 or Q4 this year. Of course, you don't want to to do that too early when you don't know whether there's the right traction and you don't know exactly what the value-based metrics are that you want to monetize around, but you also don't want to do it too late and realize, you've built a base of hundreds of people or whatever who are using a free product and would never pay for something in reality. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act there, but certainly something that we're starting to discuss now with companies and work out how that will look on a monetization stage.
You raised actually a really interesting point there that I'd love to explore a bit further, which is around the value-based metrics. When you're going to these companies and Spoke is in place, what are the metrics that you're able to say Spoke is working versus, Spoke needs to be tweaked or improved?
Yeah, so I think the single thing that we're going to be looking at is do people use Spoke every single day, right? And why is that so important for us? It's because you use Slack, you use Jira, you use email, all of these tools, you're getting notifications every day. It's not one of these, we're not looking at it from a vanity perspective of like, oh, we need to be so significant to people that they come in every day because we want some false kind of ego about it. No, rather it's, for this to truly solve your problems, we believe that you'll have to be in the tool every day. So really looking at daily active usage is going to be the key thing for us. But something that we haven't quite worked out now is how this sort of spreads across the organization and what virality looks like, because Spoke in the first version is more of a sort of single player tool insofar as that you're using it to manage your inbox. But we have a lot of interesting ideas around how that will grow and expand. Ultimately, everyone needs access to prioritized information. Everyone needs to summarize. And there, I think, are a lot of cool things that we can do and expand on as we go down that route later in the year.
Very exciting. So you've got all these companies who are currently using the product. You've got design partners. What's your go-to-market strategy? How are you acquiring these interested parties?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of different things. Like we do some outbound to design partners. I think we've done a lot of iteration there on, just reaching out via LinkedIn and speaking to product leaders there, PMs, people in product operations as well, and doing calls, giving demos, etc. So I think that's kind of one angle of the go-to-market. I mean, meanwhile, with the Slack app, it's very much like, it's kind of word of mouth adoption. We're trying to steer clear, I think, from too much paid stuff right now, because I think it can distort like the true interest, and obviously the CAC at this stage. So we're trying to kind of develop a baseline for what that kind of organic CAC looks like, and then work out channel by channel what makes sense. So right now it's kind of testing out blog stuff, doing direct outreach, and seeing kind of what works there, and then we can develop from there.
You've got a lot of companies who are cropping up across the whole generative AI space. A new one appears to be coming out of the scene not just every day, but every hour. At least that's what it looks like from my LinkedIn feed. When you're, let's say, competing with the other players who are out there, direct or indirect, why does Spoke win against those competitors?
Yeah, I think that, you mentioned it correctly. I think that there are so many coming onto the scene. Someone told me that it was 14 companies every day being founded in generative AI, which is, I don't know how you look at it, scary, exciting, somewhere in between. But I think that also tells you that the market is completely up in the air at the moment, right? So there's a lot of people throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. How do we compete? What you see is that, tools like Notion, Google, Microsoft, they're all building AI into their products, right? And that makes a huge amount of sense to, be able to summarize emails or help you write texts, ideate, whatever. The issue that exists is that there's nothing to connect these tools. And this is, I think, where Spoke can sit uniquely, is being kind of tool agnostic and uniting all of that together means that we can create an enriched experience that actually helps you use all of these pieces together. in a really, really powerful way. And I think at the same time, we are like model agnostic, meaning that we, have no interest in kind of training these models, since we're using a bunch of different models, but we're not kind of married to one uniquely, and that means that we can be much more kind of data conscious as well.
To do all of that and to build out this vision, you need to have a team. You mentioned that you have 17 people right now. Are you looking at growing out that team over the next few months, or how does that look like right now?
Yeah, I think 17 is actually a little bit bigger than we would like to be. I think, we have 17 amazing team members, or 16 plus me. So let's say it like that. And I think, to move really, really fast, you need to be actually as small as possible, right? So talent density is something big that we look at, and I think, are really fortunate that our team is very talented. Of course, we have a big emphasis on data and data science. So we have 2 data scientists and 1 NLP engineer as well in the team. And basically all the team, so 16 of us, are just focused on building. And then Max handles more the go-to-market side. So we really try and stay as a very like lean building machine, rather than this kind of more bloated sales side where you've got, 60% salespeople trying to sell something, and then product and engineering trying to run to keep up. So our focus is really like building as fast as we can, knowing that, you need to iterate and you will get things wrong along the way, and paying a lot of attention to the data side and how we can be smart and innovative and opportunistic as well in that space.
You've mentioned your co-founders a couple of times on this call. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about your co-founders, that relationship of the 3 of you coming together, and what maybe makes for a really good co-founding relationship when you do have a couple of different co-founders all in the mix together.
Sure. So I think with Max, he and I had, as I mentioned earlier, worked together a little bit at N26. So we worked on a couple of projects. And then we co-founded Plant Club together. So with Spoke, I think we probably knew, just about enough about each other by then. And bringing on Carl was also great because he had, more the data background, which was something that Max and I didn't have between us, and also as Max's brother. So, there was that part was known a little bit. But it's interesting how many people you speak to who are going through this kind of co-founder dating process, right? So they are, almost speed dating between different people. And I've got a few friends who went through Entrepreneur First here in Berlin a couple of years ago, and I couldn't keep up with them. Like they were, every day they had a new co-founder, and they were going through this process, and then they were in love one minute and they had broken up the next. And I think it's very, very hard, right? You have to find someone who you get on with, who you see eye to eye with. I know that there's this set of like 50 questions that you should ask each other about, where you see things going, and, kind of how philosophically aligned you are. I think you're never gonna be able to plan from the beginning how things scale and how they work over time. But I think that then it's about having a really open dialogue with each other. And something we do is we do 360 feedback for each of us, for every person in the team, but also the founders. We do that every 8 weeks. So we're there giving each other feedback. And I think that allows us also to be constructive and air our grievances, let's say, and work through those in a constructive way. Because I think there's so many relationships and setups where people are just getting more and more and more frustrated or less aligned, and then it explodes. And I think it's really about having an open dialogue and trying to work in the right direction.
When you were, I suppose, giving yourselves roles or domains or remits, how did you go through that decision, and how did you guys choose who would ultimately be CEO of the company? How did that all structure itself?
I mean, it's interesting. I think you have like the CEO title has changed a little bit in the last couple of years. You see companies that now have 2 co-CEOs, which to me sometimes looks like a bit of a pissing contest for who's gonna have the final say. But essentially, you also have then organizations where it's the CEO and then the rest of the C-level really sitting beneath that. We actually only brought in the specific C titles relatively recently because it was more for outbound communication. So it's more coherent when Max is going and speaking to people for outbound stuff for him to be the CEO. He also handles more of the fundraising, go-to-market, obviously, and operations. So that kind of falls neatly under him. For me, I have the product background, so that's fairly straightforward. That the CPO stuff goes to me, and Carl has the real data expertise. So that one kind of falls neatly under him. But we really try and take it that none of us is bossing the others around too much. I think if anything, I'm probably being too bossy to them, and they can tell me to shut up. But I think that it's about trying to have an equitable relationship, and it also depends, which backgrounds people come in with. Like if you are co-founding and someone has 20 years more experience or a huge amount more domain expertise, then yeah, maybe it makes sense to have less kind of equitable standings. But for us, it was obvious that we wanted it not to come down to who has this title or who has more equity or whatever. At the end of the day, we all have to work in the same direction, and it's like it shouldn't just be that we're going in a particular direction from coercion rather than agreement.
The markets aren't as liquid as they previously have been. Money is a bit harder to come by than it was at just 12 months or even a little bit more ago. It's not as easy to come by. What advice would you give to other founders out there who are looking to raise money in the current environment?
It's tough, right? I think you've seen with the market conditions, there's the SVB situation as well. It's definitely tough. What we've heard from investors is, look to cut costs, look to drive towards profitability. If you can wait on raising a little bit, then that's also good. At the end of the day, what usually happens in these economic circumstances is that companies, let's say, that were doomed to failure end up failing and maybe aren't propped up by generous market conditions. But, that being said, there's obviously hot areas and not so hot areas. I think we're lucky that the generative AI is one of the hotter areas. But, we're not in any rush to go fundraising. And I think for any other companies, that can hold on a little bit longer, then that's, I think, a good situation for them to be. Tends to not work so well when you're begging investors for money. I think the power dynamic has to be the other way around. So anything that people can do to impact that, I think, is ultimately going to help.
You were talking earlier on about how you used to work in product within Europe. You still work in product, but you used to work under another company. And then you went to the US and you worked in product there. And you were saying you got a different kind of look for how companies are run over in the US. And I guess how product is built as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those differences are culturally and in process between US and European companies?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I think that actually going over to the US it gave me two perspectives. One is, they don't maybe know as much as they think they know. We do also have some skills in Europe and elsewhere, but also there was a lot to learn about how organizations are structured and how they're aligned around kind of a vision. And what it was clear to me, or what became clear to me when I was out there, is how much more the rest of the organization knows and understands about product and engineering out there. So what I mean by that is, in Europe, you typically have kind of product and tech, and it seems like no one understands them, and marketing doesn't, and sales doesn't, and ops and biz dev, etc. Whereas over in the US, it seemed like the organizations were much more kind of coherently aligned around that, meaning, your COO may have had a technical background or a product background and had gone in that direction. And that, I think, immaturity in the European market is problematic for the way that companies are built. So in Germany, you have a lot of kind of these more like sales-driven startups with less product understanding, but it also has an impact on the investor ecosystem, right? Because you have fewer people becoming angels or going into the VC route that have a product background, which means that you have a certain type of company gets funded again and again and again, leading to kind of less product innovation. So I think that, in the European ecosystem, you have, and particularly in Berlin, where I'm based, you have a lot of money going into fintech, for example. You have quite a lot in commerce, obviously, or like e-com from Zalando, Get Your Guide, companies like this. But you're lacking then more in let's say B2B product, but also then, AI and stuff like this. And I think that, what Europe needs is a little bit more to bring maybe some more of that maturity over from the US and London as well. I think there is a little bit more to kind of enhance the ecosystem and then have that knock-on effect as, those companies make exits and employees within there become angels or investors. And that has, I think, an important kind of development implication on the ecosystem.
There's a lot then that we can learn from our colleagues over in the US. Is there anything that our US colleagues can learn from us in Europe?
So for me, I think the thing that I always found interesting is, like, I like that Europeans can be a little bit more frank about things. I found Americans to be superficial is the wrong word, and that sounds a bit critical, but I found it like more reassuring to work with Europeans when they would tell it how it is, maybe, or tell you how they're really feeling. I think I like personally that sort of cynicism sometimes, and criticality, and I think that having that openness can actually be a more genuine, like, workplace culture. And I think it's okay to come in, and I have it as well. Sometimes I walk in the door and I think, fuck, this is never going to work. And I think it's okay to be open about those things and vulnerable about that, because I think it makes for a more kind of authentic workplace.
Brilliant. Jack, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about Spoke. This has been really enjoyable. I think what you're doing with the product is really interesting. I think it's perfectly timed, considering that we're seeing this explosion in generative AI in the content we're all going to be consuming. And a product like Spoke is exactly what is needed. And thank you for all the tips that you've been giving as well for other founders who are watching this. And yeah, I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Cool, Nick. Thanks so much for having me.